Hello, everybody. Isn't this room beautiful on a sunny day like this? It's just such a pleasure to be here. It's such a pleasure to see all of you gathered for this fantastic event. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm the faculty director of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. A great privilege and joy to both work with my colleagues in the center to steward Penn's interest in energy policy and the energy transition, and to be the stewards of this fantastic building on campus. I like to say nobody can walk up those stairs and have any doubt about how important this issue is at the University of Pennsylvania. So it's great to see you here, and I hope you become more and more a part of it. And I also hope, even though I am contractually obligated to say this, I also hope by now everyone knows that this is an event for Energy Week at Penn, one of 24 events that are going on, organized by 7 of Penn's 12 schools on campus. It's the biggest Energy Week we've ever had. I'm sure next year's will be even better. I hope most of you are a part of that as well. Tons of these events are organized by, devoted to the work of students at Penn. So, and this is one that is kind of devoted and organized by former students of Penn. And that makes it as mission central as any of the events that are happening this week. For most of us on the faculty, the nearest and dearest thing we do is related to students and alumni. And that is going to be the core of this discussion, the way in which, just illustrating just some, although some of the most magnificent, alumni opportunities that this energy policy cluster represents. So, we're going to have a fantastic panel that is moderated by my friend Badr Khan, who's just a terrific kind of citizen of the world and in this space and son of Pennsylvania. He's going to be actually introducing the rest of the panel, which is a fun job, but I can't have all the fun on the dais today. So let me just tell you a word about Badr. He's the director now of EVgo, a public company dedicated to creating a fast charging 100% renewable energy EV network across the country. And, you know, no energy transition, no piece of the energy transition is self-implementing. And without thoughtful, committed players in every sector that we're relying on to successfully pull off this transition, there need to be people who think about the missing pieces. And those pieces are missing because they're some of the hardest pieces of the larger puzzle. And the charging infrastructure piece is absolutely necessary. And I personally am quite satisfied that Badr is working in this particular space these days. It's currently working to bring more than 850 charging locations across more than 60 metropolitan areas, kind of comprehensive response to the big problem. Badr's got over 25 years of experience in the energy sector, has a track record of driving innovation and leveraging technology to transform the way sectors engage with and use energy. He's from 2017 to 2022, he worked at National Grid and was most recently the president of National Grid USA, right? He has a degree in engineering from Menell University in London. What an engineer that was. That guy has built some of the most beautiful bridges in the world, right? I love Menell. And an MBA from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. So I'm going to pass the baton, sit down, get out of the way, and turn it over to Badr. Thanks.
Mark. Well, we have an exciting panel for you here this afternoon. I will introduce the panelists in just one second and provide some thoughts of my own. I have been lucky to have spent the last 27 years in the energy space. And I've seen everything from the deregulation of energy, the creation of markets, the discovery of shale oil and gas, and of course, the enormous growth of renewable energy and clean energy. I would say 25 years ago, energy was probably not anyone's or everyone's first choice. I think today that is very different. 25 years ago, energy was probably not one of the top 3 issues for presidents and prime ministers around the world today. It very much is. On Monday this week, the Secretary General of the United Nations said that climate time bomb is ticking. Humanity is on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast. It was just the latest in a series of warnings about limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That will require a massive build out of clean energy, like solar and wind, but maybe also technologies like fusion energy. It will require a total transformation of transportation from electric vehicles to sustainable aviation fuels for airlines. It'll require a total transformation of the built environment, from how we heat our homes to the materials we use to build our cities, to ensuring that everything is more energy efficient. It'll likely also require government intervention at a scale that we haven't seen to date, and it'll require us to develop, invent, and deploy technologies that are just not operating at scale or at all today. I think all of this is super exciting. It needs engineers, entrepreneurs, business people, financiers, lawyers, lots and lots of people. Today is all about careers, or this panel is about careers in the energy sector. And I think that my perspective is there's a ton of opportunity today. Personally, I feel very excited about the space. I'm involved with 2 public companies. Mark said, one electric vehicles, another is in sustainable building materials. I work with a private equity group that's literally investing billions in the energy transition. And I also work with some venture funds as an investor. And I get to see lots of younger people who are really, just stepping into the space in a really, exciting way. So we will talk about all of these things and more with our panelists. Let me first just introduce our panelists. We've got Donald Brown on the end here, did his undergrad at the Wharton School, class of 94. He spent most of his career in progressively more senior finance roles in a couple of different utilities, including as chief financial officer, and is currently the executive vice president and chief innovation officer for NiSource, one of the largest electric and gas utilities in the US. Emily Duncan, beside Donald, studied international relations at Penn, class of 2004, has spent most of her career in government affairs roles in the renewables and utility space, and is currently the senior vice president for federal affairs at American Electric Power, another of the largest utilities in the United States. Beside Emily is Brian Menell, who studied economics at Penn, class of 88. Spent most of his career in natural resources, and amongst other board roles is currently chairman of the company he founded that recycles materials used for batteries, electric vehicles, and renewables. And beside me is Sarene Marshall, who did a dual MBA and MA from Wharton Lauder, class of, I should know that one, and has spent a career in sustainability and is currently the chief sustainability officer for Galway Sustainable Capital, an investment company investing in sustainable businesses. So let me start with a question for all of you. And I'll start, Donald, with you first. Just tell us how you got to where you got to today. Why are you in energy? How did you choose energy? Just tell us about the career choices that you made.
I didn't choose energy. So I went back to business school and the economy tanked and I needed a job. So I was down in North Carolina and I went and worked for the local utility in doing strategic planning, and I fell in love. So I knew nothing about energy at that time. My wife actually worked at the Ohio Public Utility Commission. I thought her job was really, really boring. And you mentioned, deregulation of markets. My wife worked on deregulation of natural gas in Ohio, and I thought it was boring. Now I know much more. So, but I worked in a number of companies. I worked in shale gas early on in my career, and shale has certainly changed the U.S. market and the world market in terms of natural gas prices. Multiple utilities looking at power plants, natural gas distribution, and it's been great. It is really the mix of policy, commodities, politics, capital markets. There's something for everyone.
Fantastic. Thanks, Donald. Emily.
So I also did not choose energy. I kind of fell into energy. I went to law school and knew I wanted to come back to Washington, which is where I'm from originally, and wanted to have a policy practice. And so when I did my summer associate stint at a law firm, I looked at the various regulatory practices, and I liked the people the most in the energy practice. And so just kind of fell into that, doing nuclear and FERC work, if you can believe it. And that's where the fun people were. So that's telling you something. And just have taken it from there. But I agree, right? I mean, there's really is something for everyone in energy, and it has become, to Badr's point, so central to, from a policy perspective, central to policy, but also central to our everyday lives. And so it's really been fun to be a part of so far. So I've enjoyed it.
Thanks, Emily. Brian.
Great, thank you very much. My business is critical minerals feeding the energy transition. My own background is exclusively mining and metals throughout my career. So I've been in diverse natural source projects around sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere in the world over the last 30 years. In 2017, when I created TechMet, it was becoming increasingly obvious that we were at the beginning of a really severe supply-demand dislocation for the critical minerals going into batteries for electric cars, wind turbines, solar cells, and other climate change mitigating technologies. And though this dislocation and structural short supply of these metals is becoming better and better recognized, it's still, in my view, underappreciated by the markets and by the end users of these materials as a key bottleneck in climate change mitigation and the energy transition, and a key front not only in the war against climate change, but in the imperative on the part of the US and allies to balance China's overwhelmingly dominant position across the global supply chain of all of these critical minerals. So what we do as TechMet is we build projects that produce or process or recycle these metals going into the EV ecosystem and renewable energy systems in alignment with US interests and US aligned supply chains.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. And Sarene.
I would love to talk more about that in a minute. But in terms of me, I think there's a theme in terms of, well, I didn't really choose energy. One of the things that Badr didn't tell you about my background is that almost all of it has been in environmental nonprofits. I worked for World Wildlife Fund. I worked for the Nature Conservancy. A lot of those nonprofits are working on land and water conservation and, biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things I did was lead the global climate change team at the Nature Conservancy. And that's kind of how I backed into what I'm doing now. I was working on climate change at TNC. Our work was natural solutions to climate change, prevent deforestation, protect coral reefs that provide resilience. I'm very passionate about both of those strategies. We're not going to solve climate change with either of them. We are going to solve climate change with how buildings are built, how cities are built, how we get around, how we make our electricity or transportation infrastructure. Those are the things we're going to have to do. And so I segued out of those conservation organizations into the built environment space first, working for a real estate organization, and ultimately went into in-house doing corporate sustainability. And now into the investor role that I'm in now, where we invest in across this whole spectrum of transition, renewable energy, sustainable transportation, green buildings, et cetera, et cetera. But it started with, I started on the biodiversity side, climate change, and sort of backed into the energy space, if you will.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarene. So a question for all of you, and Sarene, we'll start with you. If you look back on your time at Wharton and Lauder and Penn, are there specific skills that you developed or classes or programs that you took that have particularly served you well?
Well, I think I was talking to some students earlier about, the sort of like, how did you make this change? You were in nonprofits, and how did you end up where you were and whatever? And, I was one of the sort of non-traditional background people at Wharton at the time, somebody who never took a math class in college, who ended up in the, finance, the school known for finance. But I did it on purpose because I realized that the business skills were so essential to anything I wanted to do, even if it was go back and work in a nonprofit, which is what I did ultimately. I will say I most often quote Richard Schell, who was my legal studies professor at Wharton. And Emily might find this amusing, but he walked in on the first day of class with a copy of the Wall Street Journal, and he said, "Okay, all you bright MBAs out there, you just came from strategy class and you've dreamed up all these businesses you're going to do, and welcome to reality. There are regulations and policies." And, at the time, way back when, Microsoft was being looked at for antitrust and, all these other things. And he started reading every day. He would read the first two columns of the Wall Street Journal and what was going on in the regulatory and policy space with every business out there. And now I would say a big part of my job, I work on the ESG issues. A lot of this is about all that policy space, stakeholders, regulations, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not a lawyer, but that was a wildly useful class in terms of understanding the ecosystem that business operates in and the constraints on it. Good constraints, if you ask me, usually, but you need to go into it knowing, those sets of issues.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk about the role of government and regulation for stimulating what needs to be done over the course of this panel, for sure. Thank you, Sarene. Brian, how about you? Any specific skills or programs or classes that you think have really served you well in your career?
Well, Penn was a great experience, and therefore I obviously benefited from it in many, many ways. I think if I could characterize the elements of my Penn experience, which have been the most valuable for me and served me the best in the career and the work and the businesses that I've built since leaving Penn, it's not as much the details of the coursework as much as the experience of the culture of work ethic and dynamism and entrepreneurialism and competitiveness and the global nature of the community, and hence the extent to which one learns. And I learned how to interact with a lot of different inputs and a lot of different cultures and a lot of different types of people. I mean, the business we have today has projects around North America, South America, Africa, Europe, and cultural flexibility and political sensitivity and ability to engage with different values and different realities is absolutely crucial to assessing and managing risk and building value. And for me, that's and work ethic, and I think Penn was always a competitive and hardworking environment, and even more so now. I've got two of my sons at Wharton who are here in the audience, and I think I work reasonably hard. They work, I think, harder. So it's become, or at least they tell me they do. Maybe it's so I think all of the positives that I experienced and benefited from at Penn have become even more so, with its being a more international institution and even more competitive and even more productive and imaginative and integrated with the world. So that for me has been the major defining elements of my Penn experience.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. Emily.
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to the previous speakers, I would say for me, it was the overall experience. I think the skills I initially, learned at Penn and then honed in law school were, communicating clearly, right? As an advocate for my company, I have to be able to communicate clearly, succinctly, and get my point across relatively quickly, not only for external advocacy, but frankly, also for internal advocacy, right? When you're speaking to executives within a company, they just want you to get to the damn point. And so I find that the work I did at Penn, the coursework I did really helped me to think more clearly, to organize my thoughts, public speaking, of course, I don't know if the international relations major still has this, but we had a year-long thesis program at in my final year at Penn, where I still remember I had to write 120 pages, which, all you PhD candidates out there are like big whoop. But for me, that was a big deal. And, getting the point across, getting through that kind of clear analysis and thinking, all of which were skills I learned at Penn and were really critical and have served me well in my career.
Excellent. Thanks, Emily. Donald.
So I'd say from a course standpoint, it's probably economics. As I think about business and managing a business and trying to understand the markets, and the different variables that you've got to understand and how they shift, that's probably the one that put me in the best place to really think and know that there's not one equation. It's always moving. But how do you think about all of those different variables to make the right decisions? But I'd build on his point around the environment. The part that I'd pick up and say is the people and learning from my classmates throughout my career and staying in touch with them as they embark on their own careers has impacted my learning in my career because of those connections and the relationships developed here at Penn.
Excellent. Thank you, Donald. We will have some time for Q&A, but I'm going to first ask a series of questions of each panelist, really focusing on the industries that they're in. And for the panelists, I'll ask each of you, but if others have a point of view and want to jump in, feel free to do so. So Donald, let's start with you. Because utilities play such a central role in the energy transition towards a more sustainable future, could you just highlight some of the challenges that you think utilities face over the next decade? And what kind of expertise do you think they need that maybe they don't have today?
Absolutely. So, we're all going through this energy transition or trying to figure out what the energy transition. My company, and I told the small group earlier, we put out a plan 4 years ago to replace all of our coal by 2028 and replace it with renewables, wind, solar, storage. So our capacity mix ends up being about 25% natural gas and then 75% renewables. So the challenge with all of that is how do you site it? How do you make sure you've got the reliability? It's new technology. How do we make sure that our regional transmission organization is managing for the entire region? And we're learning every day about these technologies. So for us, we've got a great plan. We're embarking on the plan. It supports our customers. It supports our shareholders. It supports sustainability, but it's all still very, very new. And so we have to continue to learn. We have to continue to talk to our partners. We have to check what the new technologies are. And that's, I'd say, is the challenge, that we have to make decisions, big decisions, but those aren't proven, like operating a coal plant for 50 years. And that's where we need, whether that's energy demand solutions or efficiency solutions or capacity solutions to come into bear to support the grid and our energy capacity needs.
Thank you, Donald. Emily, do you want to just add to that?
Yeah, just I think those are all great points and spot on. I mean, I think as far as skill sets, I would love some more people who could figure out our electric markets, right? Right now, we're seeing lots of resource adequacy and capacity issues in the markets in which we operate in. And I think they're going to get more and more complex, to Donald's point, right? I mean, we are bringing on these new resources. They are intermittent resources. They are not baseload generation. So how do we value those resources appropriately in these markets? How do we do rate making, right? We're having to get into very creative rate making. Affordability is a huge concern for our customers. So how do we make this clean energy transition in a way that's fair, across the board to all of our customers, whether they're low income or high income. And that comes down to rate making, which doesn't sound real sexy, but is really, really important in the work that we do as utilities, and ultimately affects lots of our customers' bottom lines. A lot of our customers, their energy bill may be one of the largest, if not the largest bill they pay every month. And so how do we make these clean energy transitions, make them equitable and continue to keep the system reliable? So I think, understanding electric markets and understanding rate making are two things that I think are going to be pretty key to utilities moving forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Emily. Brian, the company you chair, TechMet, produces and recycles metals that are essential ingredients to the ongoing growth of clean energy and electric vehicles. What's your perspective on the challenges over the next decade, and what do you think needs to be done to address them?
The challenges are enormous. Our industry, the metals and mining industry, needs to completely transform itself, not only in terms of volumes to feed the energy transition, but in terms of ESG standards and low carbon footprint in order to feed the energy transition responsibly and ethically. And that's a massive undertaking, which we have thus far failed to rise to. Our industry needed to invest $100 billion 4 years ago to avoid the cliff of structural undersupply of lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth metals that is now close to unavoidable over the next 3 or 4 years. And the implications of that are very considerable. And the challenge of narrowing that gap is a big challenge that requires a lot of money. It requires a lot of resources. It requires a lot of capacity. It requires a lot of skills that we don't have. So it's a very serious situation that we're investing into. It's a wonderful opportunity because these metal prices are going to have to go up much higher and stay up much longer to incentivize growth of demand that will balance growth of supply that will balance demand over a 15-year horizon. But unfortunately, it takes 7 to 12 years to build a mine and only 2 or 3 years to build a battery gigafactory. So we've got a mismatch, which is a massive challenge. I mean, if Tesla reaches their target of producing 20 million electric vehicles a year by 2030, that alone will require 2 times present global annual supply of lithium. And that at the moment, it all comes out of China. I mean, China can close down Tesla in 5.5 weeks because they buy 85% of their inputs out of China. So the whole global landscape of those supply chains needs to change in terms of geopolitics and national security. It needs to change radically in terms of carbon footprint, and it needs to change radically in terms of volume. And that's what we seek to be at the forefront of. And I'd be fascinated to hear the other flip side of the escalating demand drivers for our metals is on-grid and off-grid battery storage to facilitate the next phase of wind and solar. And I'd love to hear from Donald and others who know the renewable energy landscape much better than me, what the plans are in an environment where lithium-ion batteries are the incumbent technology, albeit not necessarily the most suitable for a lot of use cases, but they're there and they're available. But 2-3 years down the road, they're not going to be there and they're not going to be available because, wind and solar is not going to be able to compete with the automotive industry for scarce batteries as a result of scarce battery metals. And that's going to require the acceleration of other chemistries and other technologies on the on-grid and off-grid battery storage front, which is also going to create a lot of interesting challenges and a lot of interesting opportunities.
Donald or Emily, do you want to just comment on that? I know that Sarene,
I can hit that soon. And I think we're already seeing it on the battery side, just tremendous increase in prices for batteries. And I think what's going to happen is for the capacity of the batteries now, utilities aren't going to use them until they have longer lives. They're going to be priced out and we won't be using them at utilities. We need something that's going to last more than 2 to 4 hours. It would provide much more value to the utilities than the current battery technology. So I agree.
Yeah, and I was going to say, so I have this saying, this sort of, that notion of squeezing the balloon, you don't really solve the problem, it just pops out somewhere else. Humankind is full of examples in which we tried to solve one problem when we created another one. My favorite poster child for this is kudzu, if you don't know anything about it. The Army Corps of Engineers thought it was a great erosion control solution. They introduced it to the United States, and it's known as the vine that ate the South because it's invasive and it, literally, consumes everything. The mineral issue with our energy transition is a little bit like that in my mind. It's like, oh, look, no problem. We're going to solve all these issues. Well, oh, wait, but we need all these minerals from, first of all, we have not that many of them, and they're concentrated in places like, where 90% of the cobalt in the world is, right? The DRC. You want to say this, one of the scariest things I've ever seen? It was a National Geographic story about 6-year-olds with spoons in caves, scraping cobalt off the walls. Like, the environmental and social issues around the procurement of these minerals is really, really severe and puts at risk tons of companies who are trying to do the right thing to, save the planet and humanity with renewable energy solutions, but can't do it without these minerals. And so we've got a pretty big conundrum here, right? Which is, why engineers, please save us, right? Figure out other things that we can do. What are the other types of solutions? Do we have to rely on minerals for energy storage? There's things like pump storage, use a mechanical solution, maybe, you don't need those minerals to store the energy. I don't know, I'm not the engineer, but we have limited amounts of these minerals and they're very fraught with environmental and social problems. So it's not the end all be all, that's going to be the way we're going to solve it. We may just be squeezing the balloon and having it pop out somewhere else.
I could just quickly answer the issue of the perceptions of the mining and metals industry with the point, with respect to environmental impact and social impact. And there's certainly a lot of examples, and artisanal production of cobalt in the Congo is a very obvious one, where the industry's negative perceptions come from reality. However, mining can be low environmental impact, it can be responsible socially and politically, and it can be low carbon footprint, and it has to be. These sources of supply are scalable. We can meet the demands of the energy transition and climate change mitigating technologies, but we need a lot of help. We need a lot of more people to focus on the area and bring skills and energy and dynamism to the area. And we need a lot of government help, unfortunately, because the market has failed us and is continuing to fail us. And we need, therefore, de-risking and cheap sources of capital and more efficient regulatory regimes and licensing regimes in order to grow as quickly and responsibly as we need to. So I don't think there are adequate alternatives or clear line of sight to alternatives for many elements of the energy transition that don't require these critical minerals. So we just have to try and produce more of them responsibly and cleanly as quickly as possible in order to not retard the energy transition, which is what we're in severe danger of doing at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Just one thing I'd say is there is one of our students in the room has been working on a company that is working on battery technology that is 10x battery technology and 10x cheaper than battery technology today. So, Donald, I think there might be someone in the audience. But let's just talk about, sustainability. Sarene, you are the Chief Sustainability Officer. You've been in a career around environmental, as you say, nonprofit, climate change, and sustainability before anybody else was, or before the world is sort of focusing on it as much as it is today. What are your thoughts on the challenges facing us over the next decade? We've touched on some of them, but more, but any other thoughts and challenges and broadly?
Big question. Well, they're enormous. As you laid out, the latest news of this week, IPCC report, lovely, bedtime reading. We need to do this all much, much, much faster. We also, I think the one thing I was talking to a few of the students earlier, I think we need to also not be just focused on the sexy. There's a lot of unsexy in this transition, and some of it looks like things we used to do that were, traditional ways of doing things. One of the best strategies for energy efficiency in your home is caulking. Like caulking is really unsexy. By the way, it doesn't get you, venture capital like returns either, and so if you're always looking for the whiz bang, big idea, moonshot thing, you're going to miss a lot of stuff that actually matters and we can be doing right now. These things don't require new technology. We can be doing them right now. A lot of times they don't have the returns in there. And so it's about public money. It's about other sources of capital. It's also about convincing people why they have to make these changes. I was telling the student group earlier, I was working on climate change at the Nature Conservancy in the days when we thought we were going to pass federal legislation in the US and we thought we were going to have a successor to the Kyoto Protocol, both of which, went down in massive flames in 2008, 9, whatever. And one of the real reasons that failed is we failed to make it real for anyone. Nobody really understood what was at stake. They didn't understand what mattered. The environmental community, which was out there talking about these issues and, why we needed to care, was using things like polar bears and Bangladesh as our talking points. It was like, well, what does that have to do with me? Where's the polar bear today? I don't Bangladesh, I couldn't even find that on a map. I mean, I could, but a lot of people couldn't, right? So it's like, what was that doing? You need to connect it and make it real for people and the ways in which they can make those changes today. There's lots of offerings out there in terms of, the simple solutions. Demand response is a great one where it's like, oh, I can see this. I can see how I can play a role. So that's the other thing about solving the climate crisis and this energy transition. It's so massive that lots of people just get paralyzed by the scale of it all and go, I don't know what in the world I could possibly do. It seems like a job for someone else. But if you can show them a solution, with demand response and go, oh, I can make this change in my own home. Look at that. I can see the meter spin backwards. Or I can see the change in my energy bill makes a big difference. Now I know a role I can play and I see other benefits. I see the pocketbook benefits today, not, 100 years from now, which is way too far for anybody to think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, the other thing we're working really hard in Washington on is not politicizing sustainability and ESG, right? I mean, you're starting to see this backlash against ESG in DC and in the States as well. And I think, the point we're trying to make is the economic one, right? We're not making these moves for the heck of it. It's not because of climate, although that's a great benefit, of course, but it's because it's the economic thing to do, right? We're building out this infrastructure and these renewable resources because they are economically viable and make sense for our customers. And so, pushing back on that a bit, right, with the members of our delegation and folks in Washington who are starting to politicize ESG, I think is going to continue to be really important for all the reasons that you've pointed out, and tying it to that economic piece is so important.
Thank you, Sarene and Emily. I will just say that I was in my chat with some of the students earlier. We were talking about the same thing, which is to get to the scale of decarbonization that the world demands, every single person in this room will need to be doing things differently. Everybody needs to do things differently. We can't just rely on retiring coal and replacing it with wind and solar. Yes, we need to do that, and we've been doing that. But there are a whole set of changes that we need to take in our daily lives that we just aren't doing today. And so, I think that point about people need to care, I think is still something that we're working on. And the government's been working on that to some extent. So, Emily, you've spent much of your career in DC and you've been close to government. Tell us a little bit about what the feds have been up to. The federal government have been up to, sorry.
Don't ask me about interest rates.
And other, and has it been needed? And is it enough, or is there more that needs to be done?
Yeah. So it's so funny, I worked for Botter at National Grid. I worked for utilities and in the solar industry for a while. And I think kind of the common refrain is nothing ever happens in Washington. Washington never does anything. Congress is worthless. And I think if there were ever 2 years to prove that folks wrong, it was these 2 years, right? Between the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, there have been massive investments made in these resources and these technologies over the course of the last 2 years. And we are starting to see that influx of cash hit our states, hit our state energy offices, hit projects and programs in our states. And soon we'll see, the job creation. And I think that the technology advancements that we're all expecting out of these dollars. And so that's been absolutely massive. And I don't want to undercut that because it's been huge and long needed. So really thrilled to see all of that. Of course, there is always more that can be done, right? There's always a need for more investment. I think you've hit on some areas where we could really use some more investment, right? And I think siting and permitting from a utility perspective is something we are very focused on. So we are the largest electric transmission owner in the country, and we need to build more of it, right? If we're going to bring all this renewable energy to load, we need to site and permit transmission at a much faster pace than what we are doing now. And that's at the state level, that's the federal level, that's the local level. And so tackling that problem, I think, is going to be really, really key. I think the critical minerals one is another big issue that we have to tackle and figure out. The other thing I'm really worried about, and I've talked to some folks in the industry about this and some folks in the crowd about this, is workforce, right? We are expecting thousands of utility workers to retire over the course of the next few years. A lot of that is linemen and welders and electricians and all of that, but also the knowledge base in management and in our utilities. I'm actually 6 weeks into my job. I'm replacing somebody who's been at my company for 31 years, which just blows my mind, right? But there's a lot of people in the utility industry like that, and they are leaving, and there's this knowledge void that they are leaving behind. And so I worry a lot about workforce development and the need to encourage people to, I know this is probably the wrong audience to say this to, right? But not everybody needs to go to 4 years of college to get a great job, right? There are 2-year programs out there where you can come out as a welder making 6 figures easily. Our unions are very well paid, right? They get great benefits. And so I think encouraging that, and I know this administration and others prior to this administration have been pushing that. And I think we need to keep pushing that argument because we are really in desperate need of workers in our industry and in other industries as well.
Thank you. Sarene.
Can I jump on that? I wanted to say a couple other things about that. I mean, I totally agree with everything that Emily said about sort of the tailwinds we have now with these 2 massive pieces of legislation that got passed that are putting money in the ground like nobody's seen, and it's amazing. On the solar side, for example, the tax credits that are available now, we have a big exposure in renewable energy that we're invested in. Most of it's, well, all of it's solar to this point. Hydro is coming tomorrow. We're very close to being a hydro investment. I'm very excited about, but the guy on our team that's been doing this forever, he's like, you never saw anything like this. I mean, the solar industry was sort of, solar was not getting done because there was lack of certainty and lack of visibility into what the finances of these projects were going to look like down the road because the tax credits were expiring. We didn't know if they were going to be renewed, blah, 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 blah. Gone. Certainty for a long time. And by the way, really big incentives. So massive, like huge rush to solar development going on right now, which we need because we're not getting it it needs to get there fast. On the workforce point, however, everybody wants all those tax credits. They want every single last point. A bunch of them are for things that it's very hard to get done today. Where do you find the workers? Where do you find the domestic supply of these materials? There's tax credits for them if you could find those things, right? So there's a whole bunch of complementary activities that have to be put to ground in order for, there's money behind them if we can get those things to happen. And I would agree on the workforce development, huge dearth right now of who's out there training all the, solar panel installers, the EV charger, the even energy efficiency, there's so many needs, and who's doing the workforce training for those? You go try to find like the school that's doing that, and they're not out there. So there's a very big need. And that's another place where, government and others can certainly sort of grease the skids to make it happen. But the private sector as well, in terms of, investing in their own workforce, is another place that we can get some benefit.
Thanks, Sarene. Donald.
Yeah, I think the other part that I want to mention, at least around this legislation, is it's the economic development that's coming from it. I mean, there is a dearth of it, but the funding is going to provide people the funds to actually make the investments and make investments in communities that maybe were forgotten, 20, 30, 40 years ago. We're seeing significant investment in Ohio, in Indiana, a couple of my big jurisdictions or states where my customers are. And so there's significant development that's coming that's going to not only provide jobs, not only provide the technology, but it's going to rebuild some communities that were forgotten a long time ago.
If what's happening in Washington now is enormously exciting, it's a little bit late. You know, it should have happened 4 or 5 years ago, but from a point of view of our critical minerals industry, I mean, we're busy with DOE loan program applications for our lithium extraction from geothermal brines in California, our battery manufacturing in Ohio, our recycling in Texas and elsewhere, our vanadium in Arkansas. We got DFC funding, you know, Brazilian nickel cobalt project. We're busy with rare earths in South Africa and tin and tungsten expansion in Rwanda and rare earth separation in Norway, and it's getting a lot of support. I mean, what's going to scale that support from the Infrastructure Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act is efficient implementation, and that's still in the pipeline, and to create functionality and efficiency in the deployment of the pools of capital that are now increasingly being made available in various departments across government in Washington is work in progress. You know, the DOE loan program might have $60 billion of funding capacity, but up until pretty recently, it took you 2 years to get dollars out of the door. And they're doing a lot to try and make that more efficient and quicker. And then they get dollars out of the door to projects that still require government support from a licensing and approvals point of view, not only at the federal level, but at the local level. And that requires government and political will to overrule minority interest groups in favor of national and global imperatives and interest. And that's a really big ask for politicians. And that's something, you know, I haven't really seen. It also requires a global view of the energy transition, of climate change mitigation, and of critical mineral supply chains in the case of what we do. And that is, again, creates conflicts between the imperative of politicians in Washington to be seen to be focusing on US national interest and US jobs, and the imperative and the fact that you can't localize supply chains for nickel and cobalt and various other metals because they just don't exist in sufficient quantities in the US, even if you could efficiently and cost effectively and competitively develop them in the face of higher costs and higher environmental regulations and slower licensing programs. So how IRA as a piece of legislation relates to supply chains in alignment with US allies in such a way as to balance China's control is very much work in progress, and it'll be very interesting to see how it evolves.
Yeah, Sarene, yeah.
Sorry. Back to the point that Emily made earlier about depoliticizing the issue, and Donald's point about investment in places like that haven't seen investment. You know, the U.S. made some attempt at that. You know, in the ethanol boom. That was the wrong answer to bring investment to those places. Very climate negative, actually, but it did. You know, it was referred to bringing down the plywood in places like Iowa. They were like, yes, you know, reinvestment. And then it was like, oh, that was a really bad idea. We probably shouldn't have done that. But these things are not, right? These, you know, converting, old manufacturing in the Midwest to solar facilities, to other things, bringing these kinds of jobs back online are not, bad ideas. They're excellent ideas, well-paying ideas. And they also sort of, depoliticize this issue, from you care about, polar bears in Bangladesh to, like you're building jobs here and we build real things. And that's all great for everybody.
Thank you, Sarene. I just want to, before I move to the audience Q&A, Brian, you touched on, you provided a global lens just for a moment there. Let me just ask you all, or ask any of you have a point of view. What's the global will? Do you have a perspective on global will today? So we talked about Washington. How about around the world to address the climate crisis that we're seeing today? Do any of you have a perspective on that?
If I could start, and again, I'm looking at it from a specific angle of critical mineral supply chain security. China's had a free reign and has dominated our space for the last 15 years while everybody else was sleeping. And on the one hand, that's a big concern because now China controls between 65% and 95% of the global supply of all of these critical minerals that we're involved in as TechMet, which is not healthy for US national interest and the geopolitical landscape and national security. However, had China not done what China's done over the last 15 years, we'd be in even more trouble, because they've invested massive amount of cheap state money and an enormous amount of capacity in building, production of and processing of metals that we need in order to mitigate climate change. So China's still a very big part of the equation. On the one hand, we need to counter China's aspiration to continue to dominate as a key leg of their aspirations to, rise to global industrial, technological, and commercial dominance, which is threatening to our values and way of life, I believe. On the other hand, we have to work with them because this is a global problem. And to exacerbate and Cold War terminology and tension and conflict, we're all going to be losers because climate change is a bigger enemy than China ultimately. Europe is useless. I'm European. They're talking about doing the same things as the Inflation Reduction Act, but they're doing it without funding and they're doing it without mechanisms to actually implement. They're just doing it with nice words, and they're whinging a lot about the Americans.
That's what I was going to say.
And they're really kind of wanting to be somehow under American umbrella and a beneficiary of American government funding, counter China that somehow includes Europe. And they're going to have to wake up to the fact that they can't rely on US taxpayer dollars. They're going to have to do it themselves. And ultimately, there's not only competition with China, there's competition between aligned industrial powers such as Europe and the US. And it's about scarce resources feeding industrial capacity that determines where jobs sit, and whether there's a job in Munich or a job in Detroit is going to significantly depend 2-3 years out on who has preferential access to units of nickel and cobalt and lithium and other metals. And that's a reality that they're going to have to wake up to, as are the Koreans, as are the Indians, as are the Japanese, all of whom somehow we should cooperate with, but ultimately have to compete with. So it is a very mixed global landscape. We're all roughly on the same side, but we're also all interested in industrial competitive and jobs at home, and that's not going to go away.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Emily.
Yeah, so you're a great foil for me. So I think, I went to the last two COPs, which were really interesting. One was in Glasgow 2 years ago, and then this last year was in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh. And I think what was really interesting is, having not been to COPs before that, there was kind of this sense of, oh, the US is back again. We're back at the table. You're back in the conversation with climate. You've been absent for many years. And I think we got, we were given a very hard time, I think, in Glasgow, right? They were kind of like, oh, welcome back, and this was right after, on the heels of IIJA. And so we were like, yeah, we're back. We want to be here for real. And everybody was giving us a hard time. Fast forward to Sharm el-Sheikh, and we were, had just passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and they were all kind of pissed at us. They were like, well, you didn't include us, right? And we were like, well, wait a second, you were giving us such a hard time for not being at the table. We're now at the table. Now you're pissed we're at the table, right? That was kind of the reaction. And I think it does seem like the EU is stepping up, right? I saw they were putting together some legislation, some language, understanding they were going to need significant government backing in order to move the legislation to reality, right? But I do think it has created kind of this competition, which is a healthy competition, right? And I'm not a trade expert, right? But I think the lack of trade agreements between the US and the UK and the EU has actually created this very competitive environment where you cannot rely on the US and global trade to get some of this stuff done. And so that has created this competitive nature, which I'm hoping will drive towards a more effective and efficient outcomes in what we can see in the climate space and in the technology space, but time will tell.
So I haven't been to the last two COPs, but I went to 3 way back when. And but if you want to give sort of a little bit of a long view historical on this, way back in the ancient history, before probably most of the people in the audience were born, and the Kyoto Protocol was written, it had this bizarro construct about Annex 1 countries, which is basically like only the developed world needs to worry about climate change. Bunch of other countries don't need to do anything, don't worry about it. And in the intervening years, guess what happened? China, India, Brazil, Mexico, and others all Indonesia rose to the top of the list of global emitters, and there was like, oh, wait a minute, that's maybe not such a helpful, dichotomy of, those that need to worry about it and those that don't. So one of the best things we did was get rid of that stupid construct and say, everybody's got to do something. In the meantime, you have developing countries and some of the, least developed countries in the world recognizing they're going to be the ones to suffer. first and foremost. So, the will, if that was your question, was about will. I mean, the will has been there, but also you need technology transfer, you need capacity building, you need support in order to get the leapfrog from let's develop the way the US did, let's develop the way others did, let's do coal and other things first. No, let's leapfrog that to some, new technologies that don't get us in the same soup with regard to emissions. But, is the choice for those countries to stay poor and not develop? No, right? So, I mean, I think if you take a long view back to the politics of this, many people were like, hello, US, would you like to join us at the table here? Because you're busy being an impediment to this problem we're all trying to solve, including in places like Copenhagen, which, went down in flames. And then now you've got the US finally stepping up to, hey, it's in our own domestic interest to do this. We don't have to sit here all day long and say, well, when China, when India, when somebody else does something, then we'll worry about it, because we see the impact in our own economy. We see the impacts of climate change unfolding every day on us, and we can't sit back and wait.
All right, thank you, Sarene. So let us turn over to you. Any questions?
Hi, my name is Yasmin. I'm a freshman in Wharton. I had a question just about what you were talking about. So like the global aspect of this entire climate crisis. You talked a lot about the Eastern world and you started touching on developing countries. I'm from North Africa, and I know there's a lot of potential in North Africa for renewable energies, especially solar, because the entire Sahara thing. And so my question was, how do you feel, do you have any thoughts on how renewable energies can be an opportunities for developing countries to develop? Or do you feel like it's more going to be like what you described and like up when now we're to do all these like carbon regulations? Or is it more, no, we actually have an opportunity to create new markets, new industries, and maybe try to develop something new because we have these resources that other countries don't have?
So, so Sarene talked about this leapfrog opportunity. I think there is a leapfrog opportunity for developing nations. The challenge is, how do you get the funding? How do you get the financing? And that's back to the commentary about China. China sees the leapfrog opportunity. They've been providing that financing. I think other nations need to support that financing for these developing nations so that they can make the leapfrogs. What we're dealing with in the US is changing behaviors to make changes. And that's the hard part for us. In developing nations, they can get right there on renewable power and use energy in a much more efficient way, but they've got to figure out the financing issue. And that's where the rest of the world needs to come around beyond China.
One of the things I did when I was in-house at the IDB, I was leading the corporate sustainability program. And so was part of my job was like our own corporate footprint, our greenhouse gas emissions, wherever. I sat down, I took one look at this. The IDB is like the World Bank for Latin America. For those who don't know, we multilateral, development bank is government to government loans for economic development in, 26 countries. A lot of those are in the Caribbean. We had offices in those countries. I took one look at our energy footprint in several of these countries and went, what are we doing exactly? I'm sorry, the sun shines all the time in these places. And some of these very nations, and so therefore our office, are relying 100% on diesel, imported diesel to power their electric grid. What kind of sense does this make, right? Not only does the sun shine, you've got waves, you've got all kinds of other sources of energy that could be utilized in much better ways economically and environmentally than what we were doing. I mean, the big we, not just the IDB in terms of our own offices. I was very proud in a few cases to say, let's put solar panels on our country office there and not be buying electricity that's diesel powered. But you need the investment. You certainly need the investment. I'm curious, by the way, I don't want to blow your question up, but or yours. Nobody talked about nuclear, and but the audience is supposed to have a chance for Q&A. So
Does anyone have yeah?
I can say very briefly, I think, so I have a special place in my heart for nuclear because that's where I started my career. And I think it's great. And I love this new renaissance. I feel like every few years we have a nuclear renaissance, but I feel like this one may stick. We are I can speak for AP and say we are very excited about small modular reactors, and we think there's huge potential there. Whether they are developed quickly enough to meet the need of replacing coal plants in places where it's going to be hard to do, hundreds and hundreds of megawatts of renewables in order to replace those coal plants, I think is a question, but I think there's real opportunity there and we are very excited about it. And I will say that that's one thing that the Inflation Reduction Act did. It has made nuclear plants money makers in the US. I mean, those plants are minting money now thanks to the nuclear PTC. So I think there is a bit of a financial renaissance, if nothing else, in nuclear. So I hope that portends for something good down the road.
I just thought it'd be funny if the person who spent, the nonprofit person, can't brought up nuclear. But I mean, I agree with Bill Gates on this, right? And other people. It's like, smallest footprint energy production, zero carbon, baseload, 24 hours a day, anywhere on the planet, including plenty of places that you might be interested in. You can produce nuclear energy.
Other questions from the audience?
My name is Charles Lean. I'm a third year MBA student at Wharton. My question is about the mining industry and the need to make it more sustainable, both environmentally, but also the labor practices. And my question is more about, I'm curious, how does the US play a role in that? What levers do we have to pull to really bring that future about? It seems difficult given that a lot of the countries, my understanding is the mines are really government controlled, or it's difficult as a foreigner maybe to have an impact there. So I'm just curious, how do y'all view this problem getting solved? Thank you.
A lot of the impetus for solving the problem or for accelerating the industry's evolution in the right direction with respect to environmental impact and social engagement and carbon footprint comes from your customers. So when Ford and GM and Tesla demand traceability and high ESG standards across their supply chain, that incentivizes investment in the practices that deliver what they need to deliver in order for them to be able to claim to their consumers that they have traceable and responsible supply chains, which increasingly they're going to be judged according to. And government, US government, and as a key example, because it's the richest and most powerful, important country in the world, where they provide support, as they have, for instance, to TechMet, and they're, we're part owned by the US government, and to various of our projects. They need to and do increasingly enforce standards with respect to ESG and governance on those projects that they support and those companies they support, and the supply chains and the ensuring of preferential access to US industry for product arising out of those projects that are subject to US support of various types. And the tools available to the US government are obviously much more limited and much less efficient than the tools available to the Chinese government, but nonetheless, they are growing and they're not insignificant. So a lot of, and the other flip side of it in terms of what government needs to do, and the US government in particular needs to do to encourage this evolution, is to not only use carrots, and carrots being political support and funding support, but sticks and sanctions in the event of, in countries like the DRC, which have become dominated by Chinese interests and dominated by inadequate practices and standards, to use American leverage and American leverage in a aggressive sense to ensure alignment with US interests in terms of feeding US industrial supply chains, and in terms of the standards that the US and her allies want to uphold in order to have a ethical and sustainable energy transition, rather than one built on a foundation of that is less defensible. And the US has tools. The US has a big military. It has a lot of cyber capacity, has a lot of intelligence, and it can sanction individuals and destroy their lives. So, they have to be prepared to use those tools in this critical mineral supply chain security arena, and they've started to.
Is there a middle ground with US So I'm thinking about, I've spent a lot of time in deforestation, tropical forests, whatever, the US has a law in the books called the Lacey Act. It was written for ivory tusk trade. It outlaws the importation of endangered species and illegally harvested originally animals, and plants got added to it in the late 90s, early 2000s, so that illegally harvested timber is illegal to import under the Lacey Act. And so that is not a government sanction, but it actually applies to the private procurer of that timber. And they've used the Justice Department and some pretty high profile cases against Gibson Guitars and lumber liquidators to enforce that act and call attention to it, so that anybody buying timber is like, oh, I got to make sure that my supply chain is there a middle ground? I don't know minerals very well in that regard in terms of the legal structures, but other types of laws that might apply, and that might be another strategy for the US government.
There are examples of that, like the Conflict Minerals Act or bill which was tacked onto the Dodd-Frank Act, which required and gave SEC regulatory oversight in auditing of supply chains for tin and tungsten and tantalum out of the Great Lakes region, in order to put the onus on companies to ensure that their supply chains for these metals was not contaminated by products illegally mined in the Eastern DRC to the benefit of armed groups perpetrating human rights abuses. And that worked to an extent. It's a clumsy tool and it's really problematic on the ground, and it often penalizes the people you want to help, because local villagers whose only livelihood is digging for minerals can't sell their minerals other than at a massive discount to the Chinese. So it can have negative unintended consequences, but nonetheless, it's very valuable. But if the US government was to say that, you have to prove that none of the cobalt going into your turbine blades could have derived from artisanal diggings in the Congo that could have been environmentally irresponsible and could have had child labor, you're going to cripple Boeing. It's kind of a difficult thing to do. So it's not. Yeah, but they don't know how to, they don't understand their supply chains. They don't know how to judge value and risk in different industries that they've never been involved in. So one has to be careful. There's a lot of things you can do, but you don't want to kind of kill the people you're trying to help.
Great global macro questions here. Other questions? Yes. Two questions, one in the front, one in the back.
I'm Terrence Sam, Executive MBA student at Wharton. Thank you for being here today. My question is about measurement of ESG and sustainability. So what are your thoughts on that? Are we measuring this effectively? There are many measurements around and can't get lost in the jungle when you go look up there. So is that something that we need to be developing and agreeing on a standard of benchmarks to better measure and make sure that we're not just greenwashing people? And then how do we use that in our financial decision-making and our investment decisions?
So question around ESG reporting, ESG management, measurement, and disclosure.
Yeah, so my experience has been, every investment house has their own measurement practices. There certainly are some standards, but investors may only take parts of different standards. And it comes down to really kind of personal preference and their sense of risk and maybe their sense of what's being reported and how they should use it. For us, it would be easier if there were standards that we could calculate, we could report out to our investors and any other stakeholders. But I haven't seen any, and I'm not confident anything is coming soon, because people are using it in so many different ways. So I don't have anything good, on the horizon for you. But what I would say though is it has changed how we think about running our business, looking at multiple stakeholders, multiple impacts to our business. We may not be able to objectively evaluate all of them, but it comes into the decision making, and I think that's the benefit everyone's getting out of ESG.
Thank you, Donald. Sarene.
This is kind of what I do every day. So a lot to unpack in your question there. So first of all, ESG measurement. What are we talking about when we say ESG, right? Are we talking about environmental and social benefits and impacts? How would we measure those? Are we talking about environmental and social and governance risks? How would we measure those? Those are two very different things. Somehow they all just get conflated in this 3-letter acronym that we call ESG. I do both sides of that in my day job, and I've been doing these things for a while. On the impact side, how would you measure environmental benefits? Well, in climate, it's pretty easy, at least on mitigation. We can reduce it to tons of CO2. Tell me how many tons of CO2 you're, displacing or reducing or, whatever. You can convert lots of the things into tons of CO2, megawatts of solar production, miles of EVs driven, all kinds of things you can convert into the tons of CO2. Great. That tells you one kind of environmental benefit. There's lots of other potential things we might want to do on the environmental side. We might want to protect healthy lands and waters. How are we going to measure those? Is it going to be in acres? Is it going to be in, tons of food produced in sustainable ways? What about the social side? Usually you might measure these in people and the lives you impact in different ways. And what are you impacting them with? And to what benefit? Is it job creation? How many jobs? How much do those jobs pay? There's 1,000 different ways you might think about measuring these things. That's on the impact side. On the risk side, of course, a lot of these risks are things you would have thought about anyway. And everybody's got a different framework and whatever, but these are the kinds of things you think about in terms of where there's going to be a material impact on the business results, right? You have a community that maybe isn't happy with what you do. If you're in a permitted industry in which, the community could speak up to the regulator and slow down your permit or stop your project or require you to invest in something you didn't plan in investing in, like a picnic ground or a boat ramp next to your hydro facility, that's going to be cost that needs to go into the financial model in terms of, either it's a delay or it's an actual cost that affects your bottom line. So those kinds of things are easier. I think, you put those risks into the equation. Most people don't. But we do. That's one of the things we do. And then the last thing I was going to say on the rationalization and standards, this is a nightmare. I mean, an absolute nightmare. The average sustainability person spends like most of their year doing reporting to 27 different frameworks that have 1,000 different metrics and formats. This is nonsense. Why are we not spending our time trying to actually solve the problems as opposed to report it and slice and dice it in 57,000 ways? It has to be rationalized. It absolutely has to. And that's going to come with regulation. Unfortunately, not fast enough, I think, but it's coming. There's SEC disclosure, proposed rules in the US, the EU taxonomy is, these things are coming online because we've got to make more rational use of our resources so that we're not spinning our wheels trying to recast our reports, 1,000 different ways and not making progress on the impacts.
I just came from before this call. I'm on the board of the world's largest building materials and building products company, and we were having a discussion, our sustainability report, right before this panel, and it was a long conversation. To your point, we have a question at the back there. Yes.
Not a student, but I appreciate the opportunity that this was a public event. I work in the electric utility space. My question is about ESG reporting. Okay, so we heard a few months ago that Florida divested $2 billion out of BlackRock because of their philosophical concerns with ESG. And I'm concerned that that trickles down to, companies that are really trying to make an effort to decarbonize their practices. And what could the public do to raise more awareness and not have states do that? Just curious. And I don't know if you talked about that because I hit traffic, so I came in a little late. So I'm not sure if you covered that earlier.
Donald, you want to take that?
Yeah, I can start with it. It's certainly something that, my board is talking about. I'm on another board, all state, and we were talking about just the politicization of ESG. What I'd say is we're not changing because the political environment. Ultimately, we're trying to manage multiple stakeholders. That $2 billion that came out of BlackRock is like, it's not that much money. And so I think there's a lot of blunder and bluff and that politicians are making, but ultimately as investment professionals, they've got to make the best long-term decisions. And that's going to be trade-offs. They might have take some losses or not earn as much because they're not making investments in this company or that company, but their role is to look at the portfolio and manage the risk. So I think it's all noise, but certainly people are going to change some marginal investments in the short term regarding the ESG noise that's out there.
Thank you, Donald. Yes, we've got a question right here and a question in the back.
I like to think about renewable energy and new energy, but also we have a lot of fossil-based infrastructure in this country, and one would hope that in a decarbonized future they're stranded, but there are a lot of stakeholders there. And I was just wondering, how do you think about potential stranded assets, and what types of levers do you have to ameliorate their concerns and the owners of those infrastructure concerns? Thank you.
Great question. Who would like to take that, Sarene?
Well, one of the things that we've done is we've looked at that as an opportunity for investment, as Donald said before, right? I mean, you've got a lot of coal plants. It's a major interconnection point for the grid. Where are they sitting? Are there a lot of fields nearby where you could put solar panels that use that same interconnection for the grid? Well, good. Then it's not really a stranded asset in that regard. And you're putting money in those communities that otherwise you might say, well, you're shuttering this, this source of economic investment there. No, you're actually just shifting it to something different. So, that's an opportunity. And I think that's where the imagination of the sort of what could this be, right? And what could we do with this? I mean, there may be some shifts that you can't avoid, but I like to think, there was I think there's a coal plant, not a coal plant, a mine, actually, a coal mine in West Virginia, sort of mountaintop, pretty bad from an environmental perspective, but it's all been turned into a solar field, essentially on top of what was, kind of an eyesore, and it had been de-invested in anyway. But now there's an investment back in there into putting renewables in that same spot.
Emily.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I think we do not want them to be stranded assets, right? We own those assets. So we do not want them to be stranded. I do think, and we have been shutting down many of our coal plants. We have several more that will, ultimately be shut down over the course of the next few years here. I think the important thing to think about too, right, is it's not just the asset, it's the community. That is a huge source of tax revenue and jobs for those communities, which are often communities that have been left behind or in places where it is hard to bring economic development. And so that is something we constantly are reminding ourselves of. And we work very hard to find opportunities for those folks who work in those plants, who are in those, who are married to the school teacher, who can't just up and leave, right, to go get a new job. So I do think it's really important to think not just about the asset, but the community that surrounds that asset. And so that is something that we are very, very focused on at AEP, and looking for opportunities for the folks who work in those coal mines or those coal plants. And yes, repurposing them for other generation opportunities, but finding opportunities for the folks in those communities as well.
I think one additional point is that there are quite a lot of stranded assets that aren't actually going to be stranded assets, because the energy transition is a transition. It's not a binary event. It's going to take longer than we hope. It's got a lot of challenges, including critical mineral supply chain sufficiency, from our perspective, and therefore we are going to need a lot more oil and gas for a lot longer. There's massive underinvestment in fossil fuels relative to that persistent demand, which is going out 5, 10, 15 years. And therefore, a lot of these stranded assets are actually, sadly, because of our failures, going to be massive value creation opportunities, because we're going to get $150 to $200 oil on and off for the next 10 years because we've been underinvesting in oil and gas. And sadly, we're going to need more of it for longer than we'd like. From a point of view of the transition of the auto industry, it's a massive problem because, to build an electric vehicle requires probably around 25% of the labor than it does to build a diesel or petrol engine vehicle. And, you know, relative to the thousands of parts that go into a internal combustion engine vehicle, there are hundreds of parts that go into a EV, and therefore the ecosystem that EV production requires is a tiny fraction of the ecosystem that traditional automaking industry requires. So a country like Germany, where almost 20% of the labor force is in some way related to the auto industry, if they are successful at transitioning over the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years to 100% EV production, which they're all committed to naively, and they won't achieve it, but if they achieve even a portion of that, it's a really problematic transition from a social and labor landscape point of view. And that has to be faced and dealt with. And, you know, there's a lot one can do to try and reskill people and reorientate people, but it's a massive social and political challenge.
Thank you, guys. We have one last question at the back, right in the back corner right there, and then we'll wrap it up after this question.
Hi, so thank you for talking. It seems like to me there's like incredible momentum in the sector in terms of scale. And my question kind of has like two parts. So along with a lot of this excitement and planning, it seems like there's also challenges. So when we talk about like infrastructure scaling, we have transmission issues, or we have critical mineral shortages. And it seems like to me, a lot of people are planning ahead, but there's not a lot of action being done right now to deal with that. Even with like the passage of the IRA, we've still yet to see a lot of the money being dealt out. So I'm curious, like, what are you doing? And like in your jobs, like, are you seeing the intensity that's like needed to get these projects and like whatever our targets are by the time we need to do them? Sorry, it's a little bit hard for me to phrase this question. And then secondly, because there's all this momentum, I feel like there's a lot of areas for opportunity for a student. And I'm wondering, what advice would you give to a student to like where to look for opportunities, and also what skills that you think are really necessary to develop for this energy transition?
That's a great two-part question. Let's take the first part and hold the last one. We'll use that as a wrap-up at the end, advice and recommendations for the young people in the room.
So I think the exciting thing about our industry and where we are is it's really an all of the above opportunity. I mean, we need multiple technologies for the different solutions for different communities, and there's not one area. So it might be in this area, it's going to be nuclear. It might be a microgrid in this area. It might be better battery storage in this area. And so I think about it as the excitement is my company, and I'm sure many of these companies, we're looking at lots of stuff. We don't know what's going to take off, but we need to pilot and research and make investments in many, many different technologies to find out what are the solutions that are going to work for our communities that we're in. That's the exciting part. The hard part is we don't know yet. As I think about your question regarding the Jobs Act and IRA, it's early. You know, people are trying to they want the funding. We need to determine where best to invest that funding. And in some cases, the rules haven't been fully drawn out yet to know how you can use it, how you can get it, and what returns you need to provide based upon the funding you've gotten. So it's early. I'd say all of us are really, really excited about it, but there's more work to be done in terms of how quickly we're going to use those and how quickly it's actually going to help make an impact on our country and certainly the world.
But certainly there's a growing sense of urgency in Washington, in Tokyo, in Brussels, with respect to what government has to do to move the dial and make up for market failure. There's a growing sense of urgency amongst the OEMs and battery companies whose concern with respect to security of supply of inputs is rapidly turning to panic, and they're all figuring out they're going to have to invest in mining and metals to get preferential access to battery metals. And that's a big transformation, and they don't know quite how to do it, and some of them are making mistakes, but at least they're realize they have to do it. So, there's been massive progress, but as Donald says, it needs to be accelerated. It needs to be functional and efficient. And it's great having IRA and it's great having infrastructure bill, but a lot of it comes down to bureaucratic implementation and execution, which is getting better, but still has a very long way to go. So the jury's out, but at least it's risen radically. The whole energy transition and climate change and critical mineral supply chains has risen immeasurably in the level of prioritization and focus of the last 2-3 years. It's been utterly transformative, certainly from the perspective of my industry, but we need a lot more of it, and we need a lot more urgency, and we need a degree of panic because we're got some seriously pressing challenges, and the implications of failure are very, very severe.
Yeah, so ever the political animal, there's a presidential election coming up in 2024. I suspect that over the course of the next 18 months, you will see a lot of press and a lot of site visits and a lot of rollout of dollars to states and projects, because this administration is going to want to tout these successful laws that they have passed. And so even if some of it is show and some of it is not reality, I think there will be, the momentum is building, and there will be a lot more coming out over the course of the next few months. It may just be purely politically motivated, but if it means dollars to communities and projects, steel on the ground, then I think it'll be worth it.
Just from my perspective, I think that the world may have been asleep, was asleep, but I think it's not anymore. And I just look back at history and the capacity of humankind to achieve some of the things that it has. I'm actually an optimist about our ability to solve this challenge over the next 30 years. I think we've achieved this and then some over the course of human civilization. So yeah, I agree that we were all asleep, but I don't think anyone is anymore. So I think the intensity is certainly there. Let's have one last question for each of you, and I'll start with you, Sarene. Just to your second point, actually, any words of wisdom or recommendations for all the younger people in the room today who are thinking about entering the energy industry?
Well, I think opportunities are everywhere, actually. I mean, this is very encouraging and exciting to me, and should be to all of you. I am about to start teaching at Penn. I also teach at Northwestern now, and I have students who come to me on a regular basis, and I'm like, listen, like, jobs are falling from the sky based on where I see it. It looks like they are everywhere, and there's lots of options of where you can make a difference. I mean, in my own career, if you're mission driven, wherever, like, you don't have to just be in the nonprofit sector. There's huge amount of opportunity in the public sector and the private sector, advisory services, investing all over the place, engineering. Engineers, please save us. There's lots of things we need solutions for. Lots of opportunity. I would say, I gave a lot of advice earlier, but, this is more my general, professional advice. Partly because there's so many opportunities. Like, life is too short to be miserable. Do not start doing something you hate. There's lots of opportunities to do things you love here, and lots of us fell in love with things that we got to this place that's really exciting because we fell in love with something along the way. But don't waste your time doing something you hate. Also, humanity we don't have time for that. Like, do something you really love, because we need all the help we can get. On the skill side, I would just say, one thing I am very proud as a Penn alum. I am very, very proud of what I think Penn does incredibly well in terms of interdisciplinary studies. I was a Wharton and Lauder grad. There's many, many, many examples in this institution of interdisciplinary studies. We need all of it, all hands on deck, and we need all the dots connected between them to get that speed that is so essential to these solutions. So people can't sit in their silos and their boxes. You got to talk to one another, and so that we can come up with these answers.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarene. Brian.
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we don't even only need, firstly, we need to recognize metals are sexy. We're not, we are a key front in the war against climate change, and we're a key front in the war, excuse my kind of Cold War emotive terminology, but the war to balance China's global aspirations. So it should be a lot more fashionable, and it can be clean and can be sustainable. And to do what we need to do to transform our industry not only requires a lot more mining engineers and a lot more metallurgists and a lot more process engineers, it requires a lot of commercial, business, political, geopolitical imagination and energy and dynamism and dedication. So we need environmental people, we need, political people, we need, a multifaceted approach to what is a complicated industry and a complicated challenge, to feed an even more complicated and even higher stakes challenge, which is mitigating climate change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with both of those. I thought your interdisciplinary point was spot on. I mean, that's what I loved about Penn, and my experience was in international relations. It was this mix of econ, poli-sci, and history, right? And I just loved the kind of the combination of those three, and meeting and talking to students in all of those disciplines. And so I think that is huge, and certainly encourage that. I think, to your point as well, Sarene, about following your passion, right? I started off my career in not a very happy place. I'm not going to say where, but it was not great. And I learned great lessons and it was great, but to take that away from it. But yeah, it was not where I should have been. And I kind of did it because I had law school debt and I thought, oh, I need to make all this money so I can pay that off and then I'll do something fun. It wasn't worth it, right? I should have gone to Capitol Hill and made $40,000 a year and eaten ramen, right? That's what I should have done. And so hindsight's 2020. But yeah, so I think follow your passion, do what you love, find your strengths, play to those. And I also think, sometimes you think on a day-to-day basis, God, am I making a difference? Is this really worthwhile? And I think what I love about this industry is there are so many places you can work. There are so many opportunities and you really can make a difference no matter where you are, right? And so I think follow your passion, but recognize that there's a way to make a difference in a lot of different aspects of the industry.
And I'd say, talk to your classmates, friends, talk to your classmates' parents. There is a lot out there. It really is an exciting time to be in the energy industry. Whatever vein you see, you can go for a couple of years, learn something, do something else. My colleagues, my friends, over time, they've been all over the world and following things that were interesting to them and doing really, really well. So use the network you've got at Penn to really strengthen and build your career.
Excellent. All right. Thank you all for your comments, your thoughts. Thanks for your questions. We are at time. We have a reception, I think, downstairs. So please join us there. Thank you all for coming, and please join me in a round of applause for the panelists.